Screamers.
Making a soundtrack.
Opening scene and action.
Dan? Dan?
Put this. Do that.
Dan, what are you doing?
Well, I'm sorry, Gareth. I'm just fixing the mixing desk here. It's got a problem on channel 2, but I think I fixed it.
Okay.
Now.
All right.
I've fixed that synth. That was going too wobbly, but I fixed that now. That's all right.
okay.
There's the window latch I've got to do next, and then I'm going to move on to the toaster.
But Dan, we've got to do the podcast.
Yeah, but it's all about fixing. It's a fixer this week.
Ah, right.
So I'm doing my
Okay.
fixing.
Yeah, not that kind of fixing, Dan.
Oh, is this another edit it out moment?
It is.
Okay.
1 second. Okay, so we're clear now.
Yeah, okay, so I've got it.
Excellent. We can proceed. Welcome to Making a Soundtrack, everyone. This week we are talking about The Fixer. So, Dan, it's not that kind of fixing. What kind of fixing is it?
It's the booking of the studio and the booking of the musicians.
We are down one person, though.
Oh, yeah, now.
Where is Tristan?
The TARDIS is still being fixed. Time circuits can be really tricky to fix. And obviously, Quick Fit are not usually up on fixing stuff Gallifreyan. So I believe he's just coming back from holiday. I think he's been on the Isle of Wight.
Oh, how lovely. On a staycation.
Yeah, I think he's coming back on the ferry.
Oh, is that him now?
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hello,
Hey,
Tristan.
Tris.
Feeling a little bit sick actually, a bit seasick.
Oh, bit of a choppy crossing.
Not got your sea legs.
I'll try my best not to throw up.
That would be appreciated, thank you. So, Tristan, this week we're talking about The Fixer. So, as Dan said, basically booking the studio, booking the musicians. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, isn't it?
You have to know a lot about what you can and can't do with union rules, particularly in this country, maybe not so much in European countries. And you have to know the players' strengths. There's no point booking an incredible classical musician on a jazz score. You have to know all your players' strengths and weaknesses and what they really specialise in and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, there are lots of players that play on the books of these fixers, so there's a lot to keep track of.
So it's not just going through your A to Z of musicians and picking P for piano. It's all about that player and what that player's style is and matching that to the needs of the composer.
Exactly.
So, Tristan, you've been chatting with the Fixer for this week's episode. Who is that Fixer, and can you tell us something about him?
So this week's guest is the mighty George Strezov. I've actually worked with George a few times before, one of which was on a feature film called Inmate Zero with one of my friends who's a composer, Simon Porter, brilliant composer. George has been involved in just an array of really high-profile jobs. You know, to name a few, His Dark Materials, Solo, A Star Wars Story, Assassin's Creed, Odyssey. He's even done Midsomer Murders, which is obviously a huge show over here. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that he's been involved in a lot of high-profile jobs.
That's fantastic. He's not UK-based, is he? He's over in Bulgaria.
Yes, Bulgaria. So they obviously have a different way of doing things. There's fewer restrictions in Bulgaria as to what you can record. You can't record overdubs in the same session in this country, for instance. That has to be in a different session, but you can, for instance, do overdubs in Bulgaria.
Now, this brings me on to some of the things that are mentioned in the interview. Maybe you and Dan can enlighten everybody. George mentions in the interview about Dream Theater. Dan will know this one.
Okay, Dream Theater are a prog rock band, and they're all extremely good musicians, and they all play to a very, very high level.
Yes. Time signatures change every other bar and...
Yeah, it's like Aphex Twin does heavy metal.
Then, Tristan, you mentioned about overdubs. What are overdubs?
Overdubs are laid over separately to the main recording. So, for instance, you could have a pass of long strings, so long legato held notes, and then often it's the case that the composer wants to overdub, which basically means overlay, short strings, spiccato strings, things like that, which wouldn't be possible without a lot of splitting up of the string parts, meaning the resulting sound would be much smaller and thinner. So the way to get around that is to do the whole string section playing the long notes and then overdub the short notes, which also gives you a lot more control because it means you can sort of bury the shorts away in the background or bring them much closer to the front of the mix.
Then pre-production and post-production.
I think in this case, the pre-production stuff is getting all of the sessions ready. When you're recording an orchestra, nowadays it's very common for there to be other elements, non-orchestral elements. So there will be track lay, which is pre-recorded parts that the orchestra has to play to. Those have to be in the Pro Tools session and they have to be in time. As is mentioned many, many times in this series, time is money. And when you're at the recording session, you don't want to be going, oh, hang on a minute, that's in the wrong place. Trying to figure out problems like that, you just don't want them. So I think pre-production in this case is sorting those type of things out. And then post-production tends to be the mix. Everything that happens once it's all been recorded.
Yeah. You and George talked about the Musicians' Union and the equivalent over in Bulgaria. What is the Musicians' Union?
I mean, it's just basically a union that sort of protects musicians, whether that be composers, songwriters, live performances, live gigs. It's a sort of platform that these people can connect with for sort of increased safety. So, for instance, insurance, there might be legal advice that musicians can get their hands on, all that sort of thing. It's basically there to look after the musician, just like any other union.
Brilliant. And as usual, if you go to makingasoundtrack.com, each episode has a glossary button by it. So if you want to catch up with all these terms, you can go there and find out.
Cool.
So all that remains, Dan, is your fascinating facts about George.
Yes.
In our new section. So for the fourth time, Fandango.
George began his musical career early, starting when he was only 15 years old. His company, 4for Music, has become one of the go-tos in Eastern Europe for orchestral recording. He studied orchestration with Alexander Tekliev, one of Bulgaria's most renowned composers. At the age of 8, he invented a new type of mini banana called manana or pocket banana. George is also a sample library developer. Strezov sampling is highly regarded amongst professional composers. His favourite biscuit is the humble rich tea. He's a keen jouster and owns upwards of 50 pet owls which he is trained to hoot in equal temperament.
Right, shall we go behind the scenes to listen to George and Tristan?
Yes, let's do it.
George, thanks for joining us today. We're really looking forward to chatting to you about the role of an orchestral fixer. Let's dive right in. In an orchestral soundtrack, would you be able to run us through the role of a fixer?
The job of a fixer is a very, I would say, a very stressful one because it really depends. The situation is very different from soundtrack to soundtrack. Sometimes the composer has time and, the convenience of having enough time to prep the scores, to orchestrate, and then to book a session with like a month in advance or something like this. But most of the time, we're dealing with people who are running behind schedule. There is a certain unknowns in the whole process. So, for instance, the ensemble size is not entirely, fixed. In terms of number of players, in terms of instrumentation, the score gets a lot of changes. Obviously, sometimes they do have some picture cuts. We were doing a session with Rupert Gregson-Williams at the beginning of the year, which I was also orchestrating. And I know that they were having a lot of picture edits. So even like a couple of days before the session, there was certain, questions about the ensemble size, the number of players. So, and as you can probably imagine, we as fixers, because we're like a team here in Bulgaria, we like to work with the best possible musicians. But often when you don't have enough time to ask people, to come in to do a gig, to play on recording, then you might be forced to getting players that are not as good as the ones that you've already thought of. So that's the most problematic thing, because music is very subjective, and the fixer needs to think about the composer, the production house, or whoever's handling the whole financial situation, and also about the musicians themselves, whether this will be comfortable for them, whether it will be too hard for them, whether they need some time to practice, because often they're doing like sight reading, and sometimes the music is like very complicated. Just an example. Next week we are having a session that needs like a drum player to record before the orchestra, and the composer said, "Oh, it's very easy. It's very, very easy." And then we get a demo, and the demo is. It's basically like Dream Theater for drums, all the solos and everything. So the role is we have to be like the perfect balance between the composer and their team and the production house, and also the musicians, to find like a balance. And also, to make things even more complicated, we need to throw in the actual studio. Because in our case, we as fixers we basically do everything. It's like a package deal. So we communicate with the studio, with video camera crews if they're needed, and with the musicians, of course.
And who do you communicate with throughout the process? And at what point do you personally get involved, or a member of your team?
Again, it depends from project to project. So, for instance, on large stuff that we've done, like I would say corporate stuff, usually we get introduced by the composer, and then the production house takes over from there, based on quotes, financials, and so forth. Like, for instance, when we did Solo, A Star Wars Story, with John Powell, basically John just introduced us to the vice president of post-production for Lucasfilm, and everything else was taken from there. Obviously, the lower we get on the like food chain, if I can say this, basically the composer gets the package deal. So he becomes not only the composer, but also the executive producer of the music. So we communicate with the composer directly. But again, it depends. With big game studios, it's the same. We usually speak to whoever's in charge, like an audio director or like a executive producer on the game soundtrack.
So you wouldn't have any communication with the orchestrator? Is it the composer that sort of decides the lineup?
Very specific to the project. So sometimes we get the orchestrator who's speaking to all the details and all the instrumentation and everything that's included. Sometimes we also speak to the composer's assistant and manager. Sometimes just the composer themselves. So honestly, I would prefer to speak to someone who has enough knowledge and ideas about what's going on about the project. Because, for instance, if you speak to like an executive in the corporate world, and then you ask, for instance, well, how many 5-string contrabasses would you need, or what sorts of mutes do you want for the brass, and then they have no idea. So they basically need to go into the composer or to the orchestrator, and this kind of slows down the whole process. So personally, I prefer to speak to the composer and their orchestrator. Often it's like the two of them or the three of them, or depending on how big the team is.
And how do you get to know the musicians? How important is it to have that relationship with them?
Very. Now, I have to say that we at 4 for Music, we're a couple of people doing this, and everyone has their spot in the process. So nowadays I'm mostly, in charge of orchestration, copying, arranging, editing, the post-production and the pre-production in a way. And for instance, 2 of the other guys, like George, there's another George, and also Bobby. George is a conductor and choir singer. He also conducts the choir, the biggest like cathedral here in Bulgaria. And also Bobby is a cellist. So both of them are like on a weekly basis within different orchestras. And they know all the players. They know what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. And very often it's also not about getting like the best musician. It's about getting the best person for the job. I'll give you one example. There is a fantastic cello player in our country, but he's not a good team player, but he's like a brilliant soloist. But he can't lead the group well enough. There are always like issues during the session, and you don't want this kind of a toxic environment, especially if you're working on a very stressful atmosphere, because the job of the fixer it's very stressful, and you need to know not only the skills of the musician but also their personality to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So it's very important that the musicians.
Okay. There are a number of fees and costs associated with hiring musicians for a session. How do you go about working out the budget?
First off, we have a fixed contracting fee, which is 10%. Rarely we do a higher rate, but that's like depending on how stressful. Like for instance, we want 80 people overnight. So we basically have a couple of hours to get all the players. So obviously the contracting fee goes up. Apart from that, everything is fixed. We have fixed fees for the concertmaster, for all the principals, for all the tutti players, and for all the like soloists. And by soloists, I mean, for instance, alto flute, tuba, contrabassoon, those weird instruments that are usually like one of a kind in an orchestra. You have like one contrabassoon. You can have two bassoons, but one contrabassoon. So these are pretty much fixed. The studio is also with a fixed fee. There's always a necessity of setup time. In our case, we have the luxury of having our own studio. So most of the time, unless the setup is very complicated with a lot of like special requests, we just charge 1 hour of setup fee for the entire session. And often if we do, let's say four sessions back to back, we just do one setup hour for the entire session time. But again, as I say, this is like a luxury because we have our own stage. If you go anywhere else, you also need to think about setup time, and the setup time needs to be much, much more. I would say at least 3 hours. So yeah, this is, as I said, in our case, we have this software. So we just put in the number of players, the number of hours, and it does the calculation very, very quick.
So are the players paid on a kind of per hour basis? Is that how that works?
Yeah, that's right. And in our case, again, this is very different from orchestra to orchestra, from contractor to contractor. In our case, we charge only for the time that's being played. So every 1 hour, we do like 15 minutes break. So this means that you pay for 3 hours of recording and the musicians play 3 hours. And they have like 30 minutes separately of break time. There are other orchestras that do different versions of this, of doing the breaks. Some do like 50 minutes of playing and 10 minutes of break. So at the end, a 3 hour session is 150 minutes. So you lose some time, basically 30 minutes of recording time. Others do an hour and a half, then they do 15 minutes break, and then they do another an hour and a half. I was recording in Teldex this year in May. So they're doing this. They have a longer recording time, then they do a kind of a bigger break, and then they continue. And I believe they charge by the session. I'm not entirely sure about this. But in our case, you pay for 60 minutes of recording time, you get 60 minutes of recording time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of doing it, because over here, there are obviously breaks included within that price. So, if you're booking a 3 hour session, you're only getting 2 hours 45 technically.
Sure.
And although 15 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, it it is a big difference in the recording world, as you know. So, those sorts of things are really important. And I think it's amazing that you're treating your clients really well by making sure they get exactly what they pay for.
Yeah.
It's a good example there.
And also we, as I said, because we are constantly juggling between, making the clients happy and making the musicians happy. And honestly, 10 minutes, for instance, that's not enough time for someone to take a rest. Because there's, for instance, there are some people that are smoking. So if you want to smoke and then have a cigarette and then make yourself a cup of coffee, go to the loo or something, there's not enough time to do all of these within 10 minutes. So 15 minutes is kind of optimal, and they do get some, a bit of taking their mind off the music and then going back in. So I think this makes happy both the clients and also the musicians happy.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because it's recording sessions are quite a stressful environment, aren't they? And staring at sheet music for a long time, at that level of concentration, I think it's super important to have the right amount of break time. And although that sounds childish in a way, it's imperative to getting a good performance out of the players. You want to treat them as well as possible so that they deliver the maximum performance.
That's right.
Which kind of leads nicely on to the next question, which is, in the UK, we have the Musicians Union. What rules do you have to adhere to in Bulgaria to ensure that everyone is happy for the session, such as breaks and fees? And obviously, we've already spoken about breaks, but are there any kind of other hidden things we haven't spoken about that are kind of rules that you have to adhere to?
Having a union is actually a great thing in a way. Obviously, I know that people in, for instance, Los Angeles are having some sort of issues with that, depending on which side of the barrier you're at. But unfortunately for us, we don't have anything like this in our country. I mean, we do have some sort of unions, but actually nothing about the musicians and their well-being. And because we had the regime change in 1989, and then democracy came in with democracy. So that's the sad story of our country. But basically democracy came in, and there were quite some contractors that were charging, for instance, like in euro or in USD, and they were paying musicians in Bulgarian leva. So the currency difference is pretty big. And then, for instance, in 1997, there was this huge economic crisis in our country. So the salary basically became a monthly salary became $2. So imagine how crazy this is. So the contractors kept getting $300 or some sort of amount like this per hour for an orchestra, but they were paying the previous equivalent in Bulgarian leva, which was now pretty low. So all the contractors were always, trying to take advantage from their, relationship with the musicians, and there was no union to actually protect them. So when we started contracting, there was there were a couple of things that we really wanted to set up as a company. So the first thing is monthly payments. Every musician gets paid at the beginning of the next month for all the sessions they're involved with in the previous one. That's the first thing. The second thing is all those payments are accounted for. So they get pension fund, medical insurance, everything basically, which was not the case before that. So most of the time they were getting cash. I was actually being present. I was singing when I was a student at a session, and the contractor for the choir, they just, after the session in the lobby of the Bulgarian National Radio Studio 1, they just opened a bag with cash, and they started giving out to people, which is that's absolutely ridiculous. That's the cliche of like Eastern Europe and doing business in Eastern Europe, unfortunately. So in a way, we tried to create some sort of a union without obviously naming this union, but we have very strict rules in the company. So for instance, musicians, unless it's a part of a shared session, you can't get the musicians for less than 2 hours. So the minimum amount of time they can come in is 2 hours, which is in a way generous, because usually it's like 3 hours around the world. So that's the first thing. The other one I said already, so that they're like bank wires with this pension and health insurance. They get, at the end of the month, they get like some sort of an accounting email with the number of hours they've been played at. So they can also check against, what they have in their, schedule or something. Because sometimes we do make mistakes, especially when you're talking about like 400, 500, 600 people sometimes. And mistakes can be made. So the easiest way is, hey guys, here's the list. Please let us know if there's any sort of mistakes, and we'll fix this. So and the other one is to make sure that they also have a nice environment to work with. I already mentioned that we try to get good musicians, good team players, and people that are genuinely comfortable playing together. Because otherwise, the atmosphere kind of gets weird in a way. We have this company custom. So every session we take out a box of chocolates. We have this brand called Merci. So like it's a thank you. And we also try to, every year we do some gifts for them, like branded pencils, cups, and mugs and so forth. So that's the problem that we're actually faced up against. The government doesn't help, so we need to do some sort of a private corporate government in a way. Oh yeah, sorry, and also another thing that I failed to mention is, as I said, we have a very strict fees about principal, about concertmaster, about tutti players, which means that we don't get to be leveraged by musicians. Like for instance, we have a top woodwind soloist who would say, you know what, I'll actually come for this amount of money, that's my fee. And we don't do this, because we also have a great concertmaster and he'll come for another, for lesser amount of money, which is not fair for everyone. So we have some sort of a hierarchy. So we have the fee for the conductor, fee for the session producer who's listening in the control room. Then we have the fee for the concertmaster, principals, soloists, and so forth. And the only exceptions are when we have, this is the only thing that's not fixed. That's if we do a session with like a concert. For instance, we did last month, we did a concert piece, like a suite for a solo guitar, classical guitar, and string orchestra. In this case, we cannot do a fixed fee without looking at the scores and actually getting a quote from the musician who would perform this at home. So that's the only difference.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I think a lot of fixers could really learn from that and keeping musicians happy. And it's a big deal when you're working with people all the time to make sure everyone's happy. So that's absolutely fantastic. What's your role on the day of the recording session?
It depends on how I'm connected to the project. As I said, we have a big team in a way, so everyone has their own responsibilities. So, for instance, if I'm not involved with the project, with the communication with the project at the earlier stages, most of the time I'm just like having a coffee or something like that. Unless, of course, unless I'm conducting or producing the session. If I've been involved with that, I would rather, either conduct or listen in the control room. And during the day, I'm also, I would say, supervising. That's a dumb word for what I'm about to say, but making sure that all the parts and scores are printed in the order of the recording session that was given to us by either the composer or the orchestrator or the assistant. And to make sure that all the parts are printed out, everything has been set on the note stands. Then we usually, while the engineering team, they're setting up the microphones and everything, we always have the Pro Tools operator in the control room. So the producer goes in through the sessions. This is something that we like to do because it's very, very expensive. And time does start running much faster if you're having like issue with prelays or with the Pro Tools files. And so my role would be, if I'm connected to the project, would be to go in prior to the session, go through all the Pro Tools files, make sure that the scores, the bar numbers of the scores, and the click track and everything, that they are in sync. There are no like hidden errors or like issues that might come up with, which it's a kind of a problematic thing. I would say it's very important that we do it. It's very hard to do it because if you're having sessions every day, sometimes you just don't have the physical time to go through all the material. But this actually could save a lot of time, nerves, money, and a lot of other stuff to the composer and the other ones that are involved in the project. So that would be my role. If I'm conducting, if I'm like being in this case a performer, if I'm conducting, I would just make myself a nice cup of coffee and go through the scores once more, get some ideas about, depending on how it's orchestrated, how many details you have. If there aren't any, then I would probably think about some suggestions that I would give to make sure that the music becomes better.
That's interesting that you mention your work as a conductor, because you're also known for your work as an orchestrator, conductor, composer. How did you become a fixer?
That's a nice question. Well, as you know, I'm constantly juggling between this composing and producing sample libraries and doing all sorts of weird stuff. Some would say that I'm trying to get away from composing, but I'm actually doing all those things so that I can keep on having like composing be my, main job that I do, and also my biggest passion. My problem is that I live in a country that has many benefits. For instance, our corporate tax at the end of the year is 10%, which is great. But also there are certain limitations. Like for instance, most of the, TV shows that are produced locally, they're using library music, even though they're like custom. There was just a couple of exceptions. I was lucky enough to do one of them, and it was like a period drama, like the Bulgarian Downton Abbey. So that's why I was, kind of lucky to do this project. But apart from that, if I am to be like a composer full time, I need to do probably a lot of advertising gigs, which I'm not a fan of. Maybe the occasional game soundtrack once every 5 years or so. So I had to find something that would keep food on the table, giving me enough flexibility while I'm doing my own personal work as a composer. Because often I get, like last year, at the end of last year, I had a project with, actually I was lucky enough to do this, again, like a period drama, love drama story. I really enjoyed working on that movie. I even got like 7 awards from international film festivals. Yeah, so for me that was like huge inspiration. And when the director came in, that was his actually first like debut feature. The reference that we are talking about was James Horner, and Wolf Totem, I believe, was the first reference. And if we're speaking about James Horner, I would immediately think about the whole orchestra being in the same room, which obviously is kind of very expensive And then when you need to add in, the post-production and everything, it becomes quite a bit. So I had approximately 25,000 euro to do the whole score, which is a little bit over 60 minutes, and to record it. So it's a package deal. You can imagine that that's way too low. So being like the soundtrack addict that I am, I really wanted to make this very special. So at the end, I believe that I got about 200 euro just for me at the end of the process. Yeah. So, but I'm not complaining. I mean, as I said, living in my country has some sort of benefits. Probably I would think of more than one. Yeah, but having the contracting company, also my sampling projects, this gives me enough freedom to focus on projects that I like and doing them the way I want them to be done.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, George. It's been a real pleasure having someone as talented and experienced as yourself. And I'm just finding every day on this podcast is a school day. So thanks so much for sharing your insight. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
I agree with Tristan there when he said every episode's a school day.
Yeah.
An amazing interview there with George.
Lots of insights into what goes on in an orchestral session and all of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that the session runs as well as it can do, thus not costing an arm and a leg for the production.
It's interesting when I was saying before about it's a bit more nuanced than book the orchestra, book the studio.
Yeah.
He started out by saying that it's really stressful.
Yeah.
There's no dressing it up. Lots of logistics, lots of moving parts, lots of really important things to think about. But I thought that was really interesting that he didn't dress up the fact that it's a really difficult job.
Well, when you've got anything above one other person to organise, it can get quite stressful. So when you've got 50, 60 people plus that you're trying to organise all to be all singing from the same hymn sheet, making sure they're turning up on time, make sure they know what they're doing, making sure they're the right person for the job. Obviously, you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, not always about getting the best musician.
No.
That was really interesting. And something you mentioned, Tristan, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the way George is running his business is that he owns the studio as well. It's very rare for somebody to have that sort of setup in the UK because we like a fixer running Abbey Road.
Yeah.
And then sort of knowing exactly what the studio's availability is. Obviously, he knows that because he owns it. That must make life a lot easier when coming to book the studio and arranging sessions.
Self-contained thing, isn't it? Although he said it's stressful, you're taking some of the stress out of having to find a specific studio. I know some film scores that they're booked in, but they can't get all of the people in, so they do sort of the strings and the horns in one studio, and then they'll do the percussion in another studio, and this massive juggling act of getting all of those people in the right place at the right time, because it could be very easy to accidentally just say that they're all at Abbey Road when actually no, they're not. Two of the sessions are at Abbey Road, but the third one's at Ayr, or
exactly
all the other stresses of juggling all those people are still there.
And the short notice.
The short notice. You know, as composers we complain about the short notice of things, but they're really on the sharp end of the short notice of things, because we've got really short notice, then they've got even less notice.
There's a constant adjustment of pricing going on doing that job, because you quote one thing and inevitably things change. The composer says, we need a bass clarinet now. Suddenly you've got to sort that out and adjust the price accordingly. Suddenly you've gone into overtime perhaps, and then you've got to figure out on the spot. The composer wants to know, how much is this going to cost? And you can't say, well, I don't know. You've got to come up with a fee literally within minutes and say, right, okay, well, this is going to cost X amount. Can we do it? And then,
and he also mentioned that they don't have to do the minimum of 2 hours. When it comes to running overtime, they're a little more flexible, which is probably why a lot of productions do go to Bulgaria.
Exactly. There's far more flexibility with Bulgaria and European orchestras, and I would say the UK is losing work to Europe for that reason.
Obviously, the Musicians' Union have put things in place to protect the players. So that's there to protect the players, but it could be at the cost of more work being over here. But
Yeah.
that's not the only issue. The other thing is obviously the cost, and it is more expensive over here than it is to go somewhere within Eastern Europe and record.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interestingly, he was talking about creating his own kind of corporate union where the fees that he was listing about pensions and things like that all being included. That seems like a really interesting and really good way to go about things.
Yeah, it's a fantastic idea, and I wish UK orchestras would follow suit. I don't know how that would work, but I think having a pension plan in there and protection is the way to go, really. I think the musicians, if they feel like they're being looked after, I don't know, maybe this is just me living in a dream world, but maybe they'll play better because they'll have less stress. I don't know.
George did allude to that. Happy musicians equals better music. I think that goes with everything. It is a creative thing. They're looking at the music and they're making decisions upon that music. They're not just reading it as is. They're adding emotion and feeling where it needs to be. So they are being creative. To be in a creative space and to work the best, you need to be in the right mood to do it.
Yeah, but that's not to say, we're in danger of being a bit down on the UK studio.
No, definitely not.
setup.
Oh, no, not at all.
The other guests we've spoken to are all about that, making sure that the musicians are happy and in the right kind of state of mind to really get the best out of the music.
And as I said, the MU have put these rules into place to make sure that that is the case. It just so happens that because of the way that film and TV is done, it's slightly prohibitive to certain work.
Well, it means on the lower budget productions, it basically rules London out.
Yeah.
Because the client looks at the two quotes and obviously one is significantly cheaper than the other. London does lose out in that respect. But there is an argument to be had as to whether if the fees were slightly lower or if there was more flexibility, whether more work would be retained in this country. But that's a debate for another day, perhaps.
Well, it's a can of worms about the cost of studio hire and all that, isn't it? But what an amazing interview. What a lovely chap.
Yeah, totally cool dude.
Really nice guy. So we've got the music all the way up to the studio session. The fixer has booked the orchestra, has booked the studio time. Then comes the conductor. So the conductor has to come in and do his or her part. So that'll be next time. So Dan, is that a wrap?
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
How do you find us? Makingasoundtrack.com will tell you all you need to know, links to the podcast, social media links, and there's loads of information about us and the series.
If you're enjoying the podcast, it would make our day if you could give us a positive rating or review. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit that share button and recommend it to someone.
There we go. So that's it for this week. Tristan, as always, thank you ever so much for your expertise and assistance.
Thanks, guys. I will see you next time.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's a wrap.
Oh.